Hello, I'm Lee Gatiss and I'm one of the trustees of the St Antholin Charity Lectureship. St Antholin's Church in the heart of the City of London was the grand nursery of Puritanism in the Church of England during the 17th century. Every day the tantling bell, as it was called, would chime at 5 a.m. to call the people of the parish to come for an hour of psalm singing, followed at 6 a.m. by a daily lecture or talk on a biblical or theological topic. St Antholin's itself was destroyed by the Great Fire of London in 1666, rebuilt by Sir Christopher Wren, but then demolished by the Victorians in the late 19th century. Around 30 years ago, however, using money left over from the church, a charity lectureship was established. Its aim is to provide an annual lecture in Puritan divinity for the edification and inspiration of all. It is my privilege to introduce this year's St Antholin lecturer. Her name is Dr. Christy Wang. Originally from Taiwan, she studied at Westminster Seminary in Philadelphia and has done research and taught undergraduates at the University of Oxford before moving to Singapore to teach church history at Singapore Bible College. She is an excellent scholar, and when I heard her speaking at a symposium in Cambridge a few years ago on her PhD topic, Puritan conformity, church polity and Anglican identity in the 17th century, I knew I had to try and get her to speak for us. Her topic today is not, however, about Puritanism and Anglican identity, but about something even more topical. She will be looking at the diary of Puritan minister Michael Wigglesworth. It's a unique record of how he experienced the love and mercy of God in the midst of despair and confusion about his homoerotic desires and affections towards other men. What did he write? How did he understand this daily battle with unwanted sexual sin? And how have others interpreted this revealing diary? Well, these are the subjects that Dr. Wang is going to expertly lead us through in the next fascinating half an hour. After the lecture, being live streamed today thanks to Church Society, there will be a time for questions. So please do send us your questions on Facebook if you're watching live, and I will try to put those to Dr. Wang after her lecture. So without further ado, please welcome this year's St Antholin lecturer, Dr. Christy Wang.
Hello, I'm Christy, and today we are going to talk about journaling same-sex love in the Puritan world. We are going to focus on one Puritan minister called Michael Wigglesworth and his diary. Michael Wigglesworth was Harvard graduate and tutor, as well as pastor of Malden in Massachusetts Bay Colony. He was a renowned spiritual author and poet of his time, and his poem about the Judgment Day in New England, called The Day of Doom, enjoyed immense popularity in English America. But little did his contemporaries know that Michael Wigglesworth was tormented by recurring homoerotic thoughts and desires that brought him a deep sense of depravity. Through journaling, Wigglesworth left the extremely rare record of the interior life of a 17th century pastor who harbored strong passions towards other men. While there is already ample literature on Wigglesworth's diary, this lecture complicates the dominant narratives that either emphasizes spiritual paralysis and despair, or self-indulgence, or queer resistance to heteronormativity, or both. By highlighting Wigglesworth's conscious conformity to a long tradition of Protestant conversion in general, and Puritan spiritual journaling in particular, this lecture argues that journaling despair with his same-sex loves and homoerotic experience was itself Wigglesworth's pursuit of divine remedy. So who is Michael Wigglesworth? Michael Wigglesworth was born near Hull in Yorkshire in 1631 to Puritan parents, Edward and Esther Wigglesworth. His parents then brought him across the Atlantic and settled in New Haven in 1638. Having grown up in New Haven, Wigglesworth was immersed in a strictly congregationalist culture under the leadership of eminent preacher John Davenport and Governor Theophilus Eaton. The young Michael received a good education under Ezekiel Cheever, founding member of the New Haven Church and town schoolmaster, who would later become the most celebrated colonial educator. In 1647, Wigglesworth went to Harvard College, where he would become fellow and tutor after graduating BA in 1651. Among his students was Increase Mather, whose son Carter Mather preached Wigglesworth's funeral sermon. On 18 May 1655, Wigglesworth married a distant relative called Mary, daughter of Humphrey Rayner of Rowley, Massachusetts Bay Colony, and the couple resided in Rowley for a few months before Wigglesworth became pastor of Malden. Wigglesworth's journal from 13 February 1653 to 19 May 1657 survives, and now it is held at the Massachusetts Historical Society. The diary discloses a young Harvard tutor and preacher's interior life, especially his tormented conscience over sins. Very often, it will be prideful thoughts, and most uniquely, his constant sexual desires towards other men. Very often, his pupils at Harvard were mostly a few years younger than him. Same-sex desires, along with recurring physical expressions such as ejaculations due to wet dreams and masturbations, brought Wigglesworth tremendous distress, not least because Puritan America considered them very serious sins. From a very young age, Wigglesworth would have learned to hide his sexual desires for self-protection. He would also have been aware that local laws in New Haven imposed heavy penalties upon any perceived deviant sexual practices. In fact, following John Cotton's legal proposal, Moses his judicials, New Haven even incorporated more sexual sins under the crimes that demanded death penalty than nearby colonies such as Connecticut and the Bay Colony. Cotton understood unnatural was sodomitical filthiness in the most inclusive sense, including all offenses against God's intention for sex that was in their mind, the propagation of posterity. While actual practice in New Haven did not always reflect the strictness of its laws, and all three colonies we've mentioned enforced capital punishment with caution, the young Wigglesworth was nevertheless immersed in a culture deeply hostile to any manifestation of same-sex desires. So what have scholars talked about Wigglesworth in his diary? Many scholars who take an interest in the diary see it as a curious case of Puritan piety, a radical, even distasteful example of Calvinism. Historian Edmund Morgan, in his edition of Wigglesworth's diary, commented that it was hardly an exaggeration to call the diarist a morbid, humorless, selfish busybody. Leonard Cowie, author of Wigglesworth's biographical entry in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, argues that the Puritans' two most famous poems, The Date of Doom, the one we talked about, and Meat Out of the Eater, were quaint and harsh. The same fire and brimstone verses also lead Richard Gamere to say that Wigglesworth steeped himself in the horrors of extreme Calvinism in the hope that his readers would take pains to avoid the tortures of sinners. If Wigglesworth seemed unusually harsh towards other people, even by Puritan standards, he was equally intolerant with himself. According to scholars, he was hypersensitive to sins, more so than his contemporaries such as Thomas Shepard or Richard Cotton. He suffered from an acutely afflicted conscience, and at times associated his self-perceived sinfulness with God's providential dealing with New England. While some of Wigglesworth's contemporaries might treat providentialism as useful political language, rhetoric, and appeal to God's active presence as a way to impose their own wills, the diarist was still a firm believer in God's ever-present providence, and this conviction regulated his conscience, pressing him to interrogate his innermost thoughts and question his status before God. Journaling was, to Wigglesworth, an existential necessity, originating from a Puritan dilemma over whether one was one of the elect or a reprobate. Among literary critics, Wigglesworth, the defiant sinner, or even queer resistant, overshadows Wigglesworth, the extreme Calvinist. while early modern sodomy was multivalent in meaning, and hence not the modern notion of homosexuality, Wigglesworth's identification of sodomy within himself as sexually specific, and this identification was a carefully crafted strategy for regulating sexual sins. Scholars argue that this regulating mechanism is a fount of sexual creativity. Nicholas Riddle, for example, observes that Wigglesworth intentionally produced sodomitical self in his diary or the self-articulating sodomite in order to keep his love for God in devotion to God as wholly other, as wholly non-erotic. Journaling homoerotic desires and sodomitical activities might have been Wigglesworth's way to resisting perceived sins, but the diary's intense preoccupation with sins might also have been a form of self-indulgence. Wigglesworth did not simply renounce or resist sin, but he gratified in indulging them. In a more recent article, this reasoning is pushed further by labeling Wigglesworth's journaling of same-sex desires as evidence of queer sacramental temporality. Borrowing the language of temporality from queer theories, this article asserts that Wigglesworth so depended on the conviction of sexual dissidence as part of his preparation for the Lord's Supper that the self-damnation, that is the journaling of and meditating on homoerotic desires, becomes its own sacramental assurance, disconnected from the theological and material content of the Sabbath, the Lord's Supper. While in the Puritan mind, conviction of sin should lead to repentance, this article argues that Wigglesworth's queer piety separated the two. Conviction of sin did not lead to repentance nor progressive sanctification, but became a repetitive end to itself. The diarist was stuck in a queer cycle of repetition, and this queer sacramental temporality rejected forward linear temporal movement and the progressive goals of Puritan sequential temporality. It is apparent that historians of Puritan piety on the one side and literary critics on the other adopt different approaches to interpret Wigglesworth's diary and tease out many different meanings from the text. Scholars nevertheless share one observation. Wigglesworth's diary is categorized by despair. The recurring nature of same-sex desires and irresistible homoerotic thoughts and behavior brought Wigglesworth to intense self-doubt. This is either a spiritual crisis of an unforgiving Calvinist who simply couldn't rest in Christ's salvific assurance, or a queer resistant who transformed journaling and mourning into self-indulging spiritualization of homoeroticism. Scholars also seem to agree that the origin of this unusually strong despair and a sense of defeat is Wigglesworth's lack of progress in sanctification. To prove this, for example, one article points to the ending remarks of the diary, and I quote, "Yet I find my heart as carnal as some years since for all I can tell." Indeed, there are many other passages scholars can point to show how the deeply troubled Wigglesworth was a fairly accomplished hypochondriac. Even if there were moments of hope, the diarist's piety was at best an exaggerated version of what Patricia Colwell has famously termed a Puritan seesaw of hope and despair, or even spiritual paralysis with deadness of the heart. There are insightful observations in this image of acute despair and even queer resistance, but there are problematic assumptions as well. First of all, recurring and rigorous self-examination of sins before the communion should not be set against linear progressive temporality, while the tension between recurring rigorous recurring doubts and recurring conviction of sin on the one side, and the ideal of progressive sanctification was real in the Puritan mind. There was this tension, but an overemphasis on this antithesis and scholarly tendencies to sexualize this perceived tension as if one is queer and the other heteronormative leads to the conclusion that Wigglesworth ultimately and necessarily found resolution outside of his God. This lecture seeks to respond to assertions that Wigglesworth's recurrent experience of personal depravity makes impossible the progressive goals of Puritan sequential temporality, and that the diarist relished his homoerotic desires and displayed profound resistance to God's mercies, even in the midst of praises and implicit affirmation of divine grace. Rather than demolishing all the observations that led to these conclusions, I will instead demonstrate that even if his recursive reflections on same-sex love and homoerotic desires might have led to acute despair and even a sobering acknowledgement that complete eradication of such desires was impossible, the same despair and powerlessness did not extinguish Wigglesworth's hope of sanctification and redemption, but establish it. Adhering closely to the tradition of Protestant conversion narratives, and more narrowly, the distinctively Puritan practice of journal keeping, the diarist believed that experiencing total despair was a necessary step towards Christ-centered hope, and the very act of writing was Wigglesworth's conscious declaration of his status as one of the elect. So Puritans incorporated spiritual battles and accompanying anxiety as essential elements of the conversion experience. They believed that conversion occurred out of the depths of the greatest despair and after periods of greatest affliction. There was a much stronger tradition at work that emphasized conversion both as an initial event as well as a continual process throughout a believer's life. Even after the first original conversion, believers continue to grapple with the authenticity of their salvific status and relationship with God. Professing anxiety, spiritual paralysis, and even despair was but a crucial first step in a believer's conscious turn to a psalmist refrain in the Protestant conversion tradition. Continental reformers had stressed the psalmist movement from despair and powerlessness, cries for help, and finally towards resolution in God's merciful response. Passivity, or even a sense of defeat, were an essential part of this process. Martin Luther addressed conversion multiple times in his lectures on the Psalms. Conversion cannot be done by human strength, only by divine strength. So the powerless sinner must seek to be converted by God. Similarly, John Calvin commended the Psalms as the anatomy of all the parts of the soul, in which prophets disclose their inmost thoughts and cause the reader to seek out their own infirmities and vices. The Psalms were therefore a spiritual guide for believers to be awakened to a sense of their own depravity and at the same time instructed in seeking remedies for their cure. This process of conviction of sin, seeking help, and resolution in divine grace was for Calvin a way to win spiritual battles. So Calvin said, and I quote, "Even when in the midst of doubts, fears, and apprehensions, let us put forth our efforts in prayer until we experience some consolation which may come and bring contentment to our minds." Puritans come close to this tradition of continual conversion. Thomas Shepard, pastor of the Cambridge First Church and mentor to many Harvard pupils and scholars, have preached about being always converting and ever doubting, and his emphasis on continual conversion profoundly influenced Wigglesworth. As many historians of religion observe, Puritans not only believed in continual conversion, but many of them were experimental Calvinists. And by experimental Calvinists, we mean those who constantly and actively pursue evidence of election and hence evidence of assurance through personal experience, most often through rigorous, regular self-examination. Tom Webster further highlights this context as a necessary interpretive framework for understanding Puritan diary keeping. which was in essence a distinctive way to make experience conform to a teleology of grace. For Shepherd and Wigglesworth, journaling delineated their spiritual trajectory from destroying the old man to creating a new self, Colossians 3. Again, this trajectory was not a simple linear progress, but expressed itself through a circular piety of continual conversion. Therefore, if one reads Wigglesworth's words of despair from the perspective of this experimental Calvinism, the diarist's intentional resort to the psalmist's refrain becomes obvious. His petitions and proclaimed resolutions in divine grace that so often follow his mournings over sins also become much more noticeable. Instead of setting his own repeated sacramental piety against linear progressive sanctification, Wigglesworth consciously incorporated recurring despair, powerlessness, and petitions as a driving force for his ultimate experience of being converted by Christ. This lecture, therefore, chooses to follow this interpretive approach of historians of religion, such as Tom Webster, to complicate or at least enrich the observations made by literary critics, such as the ones we talked about, the articles that we just cited. In the following, I will demonstrate that what scholars point out as Wigglesworth's utter passivity in his relentless groaning over his sexual sins did not necessarily lead to an eventual resolution in homoerotic self-indulgence, but the very act of journaling recurring despair empowered Wigglesworth to petition for grace and even find relief in his trust in a merciful God. So now let us dive into the diary. The diary begins with frequently cited lines of Wigglesworth's laments over unnatural, filthy lust that are so often, even this day, in some measure, stirring inside him. This type of lament permeated the diary and is the reason why scholars tend to describe Wigglesworth's journal as one of overwhelming despair. However, what is equally persistent in this pattern of lament is petition and even recognition of hope. Immediately after the opening confession that's been cited so many times, his unnatural filthy lust, Wigglesworth professed his belief in Christ's dying love and provision of himself in the Lord's Supper. These were not mere professions to Wigglesworth, who went on to declare, and I quote, "This gives me hope. Blessed be thy name." A few entries later was another widely cited groaning of the diarist, and I quote, "I find such irresistible torments of carnal lust and or provocation, unto the ejection of seed, that I find myself unable to read anything to inform me about my distemper because of the prevailing or rising of my lusts." However, petitions follow. "Thou hast destroyed thyself, but in me is thy help. Lord, help me find help in thee, though I have destroyed myself by my iniquity." After a few more days categorized by similar anxieties over his carnal lusts, pride, and vain thoughts, Wigglesworth's unceasing petitions for God's help turned to affirmations of divine love. And I quote, "A little at length the Lord did breathe this evening and gives me to see the riches of his love continue, though I continue my provocations." Examples of this cycle of distress, petition, and affirmation abound in the diary. In another early entry in March 1653, Wigglesworth confessed, "Much distracted thoughts I find arising from too much doting affection to some of my pupils." Right after this yet another frequently cited confession of having no power to love and praise God was his affirmation of timely divine guidance. And I quote again, "God leads me not without some shakings and visitations of his spirit in his ordinances this day." Prayers of petitions in the next few days follow this perceived divine intervention, citing Psalm 63. "Lord, shed thy love abroad in my heart. Inflame me with love to thee again. Where are those sweet breathings of thy spirit which sometime I have found? O restore to me the sense of thy favor, which is better than life. If this round of despair did not end in clear redemptive resolution, remarkable confidence in God's favor revived Wigglesworth a few days later. Verily thou art my father, though my spot be not the spot of thy children. Witness my daily sensual glutting my heart with creature comforts. Witness this day pride and vain thoughts that overrun my soul. I'm not able to think a thought aright. Yet art thou my father. Thou hast found me when lost, comforted me when distressed, assisted me when unable to do thy will. Thy visitations preserve me, preserve my daily decaying spirits. Thy right hand upholds me. If this triumph was momentary and gave way to another round of confession of vain thoughts and trouble, devoted frame in reference to my pupils, psalmist petitions quickly return as well. O hide not thy face from me, O thou that have delivered my feet out of the miry clay, O thou that have brought me out of the iron furnace, to whom I have sung songs of praise. Scholars such as Ellen Bray insightfully delineate Wigglesworth's attempts to conform to a normative trajectory of Puritan manhood by seeking the legitimate outlet in marriage, as an outlet of sexual urges. Scholars observe that the unsettled Harvard scholar of the early entries has become husband, father, minister by the diary's end. But the obsession with sinful pride and sexual fantasies did not diminish. This leads scholars to conclude that this perpetuating preoccupation with his own violence or lack of progress overthrows the conventional narrative development. However, it is equally evident that Wigglesworth, the married pastor, continued to conform to his perceived sinfulness to the psalmist narrative of continual conversion, and hope continued to be one of the dominant themes. Wigglesworth married Mary Rayner in May 1655. As many scholars point out, shortly after the wedding, the diarist disclosed the heartbreaking horror of finding himself plagued by the same forbidden desires. I feel the stirrings and strongly of my former distemper even after the use of marriage, the next day, which makes me exceeding afraid. However, after this initial frustration, bouts of despair were matched with noticeably more and longer narrations of encouragement. In the following year, in the next 12 months, basically, Wigglesworth often recorded his determination to remember incidences of divine comfort and occasions of affliction that empowered him to notice God's undeserved free mercy. Journaling divine mercies was Wigglesworth's way of battling fears of weaknesses and despairing doubts. This becomes most prominent when the diarist juxtaposed his distressing worries about the upcoming winter with biblical references to God's attributes, provisions, and mercies in an entry in mid-September 1655. These worries include his frail health that might prevent him from ministry, lack of space at home, with his mother and sister joining him at Rowley from New Haven, and finally, persistent fear of a resurgence of his grievous disease as well as the exposure of it. And he was referring to his sexual struggles. These were countered, however, by several scriptural promises, including a citation of Psalm 50:15. Call upon me in the day of trouble, and I will hear thee, and thou shalt glorify me. Therefore, instead of submitting to self-indulging homoerotic desires due to lack of progress, Wigglesworth repeatedly recalled his past as filled with divine mercy. God will guide and provide. He had done so in troubles as great as these, and therefore he can do it and will do it. In order to remember God's former mercies, Wigglesworth drew a pillar to the praise of his grace. So he actually drew a pillar in the diary named Ebenezer, a reference to Samuel's stone of memorial that celebrated God's help in the Israelites' triumph over the Philistines in 1 Samuel 7, verse 12. Some scholars observe that Wigglesworth's pillar of Ebenezer looks strangely phallic, while others choose to emphasize the diary's genuine gratitude and confidence in a faithful, merciful God. These two observations, one that point out that the drawings seem to be sexually suggestive, and the other emphasizing God's mercy, these two observations need not contradict each other, especially when the question of whether the drawing meant to be in some way sexual remains a mystery. It is, however, clear that Wigglesworth's pillar is situated within a series of praise, thanksgiving, and hope. As if a drawing of memorial was not enough, a few months later, Wigglesworth named his firstborn daughter Mercy, as she was born in February 1656. Scholars rightly observe that Wigglesworth's diary is unusual in its intense obsession with sin and depravity. Recurring homoerotic desires and wet dreams deepen this obsession and frequently cast the diaries into spiritual crisis and despair. Seen from this perspective, Wigglesworth's diary has unique and distinctively Puritan features. It is unique because very rarely do we see a diary that exposes so vividly a Puritan's same-sex desires and their accompanying pain and despair. Deviant sexual desires, behavior, or dreams were by no means uncommon in 17th century England and New England. In fact, one of the most famous 17th century diarists, Samuel Pepys, recorded sexual encounters with more than 20 women, including many incidents of outright sexual abuse. But Pepys expressed very little remorse when he documented these perceived sins. William Laud, Archbishop of Canterbury under King Charles I, occasionally recorded encounters or dreams of male intimacy, coded with opaque descriptions such as great kindness. One of these diary entries concerned Archbishop Laud's dream, recalling how the Duke of Buckingham behaving himself with great kindness towards him. Again, Laud did not feel compelled to conclude these entries with confessions or prayers or petitions. It would be wrong, however, to then assume that Wigglesworth stood out as particularly troubled by sexual sins or fantasies. He might have been, but the key difference lies in the fact that diary keeping performed different functions to different people in early modern England and New England. Neither Samuel Pepys nor William Laud picked up journaling as a habit because they saw the practice as an essential experience of continual conversion. They were not experimental Calvinists. It would also be a mistake to categorize Wigglesworth as merely passive in his battles against same-sex desires and other perceived sins. The very act of journaling revealed a psalmist who believed that he must acknowledge his powerlessness as the first step in seeking divine rescue. While Wigglesworth repeatedly lamented his many failures, he painstakingly reiterated that he longed for God's salvific intervention rather than any form of self-empowerment. From this perspective, Wigglesworth's diary keeping bore a stronger resemblance with those of other Puritans who are not troubled by same-sex desires. Puritan minister Samuel Ward, for example, regularly noted down his sins. Some of his confessions seem rather trivial, such as immoderate eating of walnuts and cheese after supper, while some others concern adulterous or ill dreams, and even more frequently pride. These are strikingly similar to Wigglesworth's preoccupation with sins in his diary. Thomas Shepard likewise repeatedly contrasted his lust to his insufficient devotion to God. Furthermore, Puritans often regarded discovery of sin and accompanying agony as God's loving providential discipline upon true believers. Suffering, including sorrows over one's sins, physical weaknesses, or even natural disasters, was evidence that the individual was actively engaged in the struggle against sin and was therefore already singled out by God. Reading his diary through this lens of a Protestant conversion narrative, Wigglesworth's despairing groaning and the narrating thereof were far from signs of defeat or resignation. Instead, they were his weapon against spiritual destruction, and indeed signs of God's mercy and favor upon him. Thank you very much.
And I'm joined this evening by Dr. Wang, our lecturer for this year. Welcome.
Hi, thank you for inviting me.
You're very welcome indeed. And also joining us this evening for a time of Q&A is Dr. Mark Burkill, who's one of the pastoral advisors for the Bishop of Ebbsfleet, a former vicar in the East End of London, and one of the other trustees of the St Antholin Lectureship. Well, thank you so much for an excellent lecture. I've really enjoyed reading it and editing the video and chatting with you about it. When I first met you, Christy, it was at a St Ebbs weekend away that I was speaking at while you were still a graduate student. And then you spoke at a symposium here in Cambridge about Edward Reynolds and Anglican church polity and conformity and issues of polity in the 17th century. And when I heard you, I knew we had to get you to be one of the Antholin lecturers. But I thought at first you might do that sort of subject, Anglican identity and Puritanism and so on. But you came up with this excellent idea instead. So tell us all watching this evening, and it's great that a number of you have joined us on Facebook tonight. Thank you for being here. And if you've got questions to add to mine, please do put them in the chat and I'll put them to Christy. But tell me, what was it that drew you to this topic particularly as your subject for the lecture?
Thank you. I think it is, first of all, I think as a topic itself, it was just very interesting as a scholar of Puritanism, or more generally kind of religion in 17th century. You don't see a lot of records of same-sex desires. So when I came across, I can't remember how I first noticed this diary. I thought it was fascinating. And I do think as a historian, I really like to see the differences between 17th century Puritan society and religion and kind of 21st century, let's say more specifically maybe Church of England, or more generally just Christian church and the wider society as well. As I think not just the differences, but the similarities, I think help us know ourselves better. And I think in this particular topic, the difference between, for example, kind of modern notion of homosexuality and sodomy, or more generally, or more narrowly, same-sex desires or behavior, it is illuminating just to see how we can reflect on sexual identities as something quite modern and part of our current culture. I think similarities are helpful as well. I think it was very helpful to see how Christians in the past felt the need to battle against sexual sins, or even Puritans. Sometimes I think Christians today can, I think to an extent, idolize Puritans, and that might not always be helpful to idolize Christians in the past, but to see how they went through very similar circumstances, I think probably more helpful in a more kind of conservative, evangelical setting, where maybe Christians feel more of a need to battle against certain sins on their own, or maybe that shouldn't be the case, and it's definitely not that. People are definitely more open to share their either same-sex desires or other type of struggles, but because of what we believe in, sometimes people felt like we have to bring this to God first. We have to. It's a great thing to do that, to do prayers or journaling. But you can also feel quite lonely when you're almost going against what the wider society is telling to do. And it is very encouraging, I think, as a historian, to see how even in the midst of very intense struggles, there are people who've gone through this in the past, and there are a lot of struggles, not just this particular kind of sexual type of struggle. You can very often feel quite lonely, and I really like, for example, like singing old hymns at church, and you're not just singing it because you believe it, and your fellow congregants believe it, but the fact that it's been sung throughout the ages. I think there's a very similar way I think church history does the same thing.
We read to know we're not alone.
Yeah.
Now, Christy, your lecture is going to be published as a little booklet by Latimer. Here is the cover, and it says that the title of the lecture is "By Love to Them, I Cease of Loving Thee." By love to them, I cease of loving thee. Can you just explain where that comes from, what it means in the context, just briefly? What's that about?
Sure. So it was in the diary. And the diary itself was very much, sometimes it was his prayers, sometimes it was his reflections, sometimes it was very much a conversation. So like a prayer with God. And that was one of those. We came out of that context. I thought it was really, it was revealing, because the way he understood that struggle, obviously very different from the way we understand it today. But there was something that was very almost beautiful in that. The fact that, first of all, he didn't always categorize how he felt as something just absolutely negative. He used a wide range of vocabulary. Very often we see people talk about sexual sins as lust and as filthiness, was something, especially when it comes to something that's not kind of a traditional sense of or kind of sex within a kind of traditional marriage. In a Christian context, very often it is categorized as unnatural, and you see all of those in the diary. But sometimes it is affections, it is love. Scholars have said affections have other meanings as well in early modern English society, but love is something that's more general. And I think he wanted to contrast that love towards other people, other men specifically, to his love of God. And he see that as the main obstacles in cultivating his relationship, intimacy with God. And I thought that was very helpful to see to help us understand why he kept going back to that topic in the diary, and why that was so important to be addressed.
Brilliant. Thank you. Mark Burkill, do you have a question you want to put before we go to those on Facebook who are putting questions in the chat or sending them over? Yeah. Mark.
Yeah, I just one really about it's more to do with the nature of the diary or diary keeping in general. Why did the diary stop? Did it survive as a historical accident? Do you think in Puritan diary keeping, journaling, he would have looked back at past entries and things like that? Then, of course, there's sort of 50 years of post-diary life. Do we know anything about that? The sort of context of the diary in which he's keeping, yeah.
Definitely. I think for Wigglesworth, unlike some other diarists, like Samuel Pepys, for example, we were just talking about that.
I know.
Wigglesworth, I think that diary, by the nature of it, was very, very private. So I think we could safely, assume that for people like Wigglesworth, they journal more than that, probably for decades. But that was the bit that survived, most likely through kind of family who kept personal papers, and then people then came across the diary and then made a decision to make it public. Very much, I think, in this case, when he was alive, when we get asking, he probably would say this is definitely something to be kept as private as possible. In terms of Wigglesworth, what was the about diary keeping? So yeah, we don't have any other of his diary records that survive. He did live on for quite a while longer after that, all the way until 1705. And it's hard to tell in terms of his kind of sexual struggles whether he continued, although we could probably assume that he might have. He got married, I think, if I remember, 3 times. And when he was older, the last marriage, it was quite controversial because the woman he wanted to marry was so much younger than him. Although at the same time, it was also not uncommon at the time. So he did continue to pursue marriage even after his first wife died. Is there anything I missed, actually, in terms of your question?
Yeah, that's okay. Thank you. It's just the general context of it. That's fine. Let the others get on with it.
There is one question that has come in, actually, which is about that. Someone says, did Wigglesworth talk about his marriage and or his wife in the diary or elsewhere? Do we have anything other than the shift in the tone of the diary that you mentioned to indicate whether the marriage was a source of further distress or a source of comfort? Do we know anything about that?
Yeah, we don't know much beyond the diary in terms of his relationship with his wife, but it was revealing when he occasionally mentioned that he didn't really want to share the same bed with her. I think the reason he gave was not so much that he found the fact that they were sleeping together in some way disgusting or like feel unnatural in terms of the act itself, but he very often expressed fear related to that. I think most the wording that he used suggests that he was most likely afraid that if he had some kind of physical expression of his sexual desire, maybe like wet dreams, or maybe if he had any kind of expression like that whilst in the same bed with his wife, she might find out. So there were kind of bits of that in the diary, and more than once he mentioned that really kind of sharing the same bed was unbearable. So there was that. In terms of his subsequent marriages, it's we don't know much at all, and it was apparent that people around him didn't know this particular struggle that he had, other than the fact that he did confide with a couple of doctors and very close friends in terms of some kind of disease that he felt like he had. And he might have, we don't know how much he disclosed, but his friends then suggested, yeah, maybe the best way to address that is to get married. But in terms of the extent to which he disclosed his disease or struggles, we are not able to tell from the diary itself.
Very interesting. There is some further evidence of how he felt about things generally, I think. When you told me you were going to do this on Wigglesworth, I thought, I don't know much about him. I must go and do some research. So I got hold of a copy of The Day of Doom, which is his poem, his epic poem about the Day of Judgment, and also a work that he wrote on eloquence. But The Day of Doom, I think, was published in 1662, a very famous year for the Puritans. And just looking back over my copy of it, my annotations, can I read a bit? I think it's relevant to some of the things we've been talking about. So here's stanza 58. It's very long. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but here's a few stanzas. What will happen on the day of judgment is what he's talking about at this point. And he says, all filthy facts and secret acts however closely done, and long concealed, are there revealed before the midday sun. Deeds of the night, shunning the light, which darkest corners sought, to fearful blame and endless shame, are there most justly brought. And as all facts and grosser acts, so every word and thought, erroneous notions and lustful motion, are unto judgment brought. No sin so small and trivial, but hither it must come, nor so long past, but now at last it must receive a doom. And it is pretty unrelenting, this poem, about the different aspects of the day of judgment. But then when you get to the end and you hear what he says about the hope of the saints, of Christians, he says this, if you can indulge my reading of the poetry. O blessed state of the renate, by which he means the regenerate, the reborn. O blessed state of the renate, O wondrous happiness, to which they're brought beyond what thought can reach or words express. Grief's watercourse and sorrow's source are turned to joyful streams, and their old distress and heaviness are vanished like dreams. For God above, in arms of love, doth dearly them embrace, and fills their sprites with such delights and pleasures in his grace, and shall not fail, nor yet grow stale through frequency of use, nor do they fear God's favour there to forfeit by abuse. For there the saints are perfect saints, and holy ones indeed, for all the sin that dwelt within their mortal bodies freed, made kings and priests to God through Christ's dear love transcendency, there to remain and there to reign with him eternally. So although he thinks all our sins of even the secret filthy sort are going to be judged, he has great hope that the saints, those who trust in Christ and are reborn in him, will have all their sin, their indwelling sin, taken away at the last day. So I think that shows us actually a glimpse of the hope that he had in Christ. He wasn't without hope because of his secret lust. He knew where to take that, and that he still trusted in Christ for hope to the end. Do you think I've interpreted that rightly? I think it comes in with what you said about his understanding of it.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I can see how in current scholarship, there are people putting different emphasis on different bits of the poem or the diary. And I think that's a problem, which is also what this lecture tries to address. I definitely agree with you on that. And also, I think the diary itself is obviously of a very different genre and very private, but there's this sense that believers need to continue to grapple with their relationship with God. They have to continue to reflect on whether they've done anything to offend God and to repent and to grow, and as well as a sense of hope. Obviously, in terms of writing the poem, there was a strong awareness that this is for other people. This is for an audience. But you can see from the diary itself that he believed in what he wrote later on in the poems. He might have, a lot of scholars would say he might have spent too much time dwelling on God's judgment and his own sins. And some scholars probably have had a very negative description of portrayal of him because of that. But I think there is a sense of hope, and it was very clear. And it is important to see this whole narrative and the way he addressed his own problems and the way he addressed other people with that understanding of salvation and hope in mind. So, yeah.
Did you see what you were saying there? It was actually a very popular book, wasn't it? The Day of Doom. It was, Perry Miller describes it as America's first bestseller.
Yeah.
Wasn't really trumped in that regard until Benjamin Franklin wrote a book on wealth, which everybody, which is quite telling about American history, really, isn't it? We go from thinking about eschatological things and the day of doom and Christ coming again to suddenly thinking about wealth. But this, as you say, the poem was written for an audience. The diary was not. He didn't necessarily intend it to be published or anything like that. Unlike Samuel Pepys, of course, who's very open about his sexual exploits and did want it to be published at some point.
Yeah.
Do you think there's a reason? You mentioned Pepys, of course, and Archbishop Laud, and his struggles there too. Do you think there's an interesting any interesting differences between Wigglesworth and Pepys in the way that they talk about their sexual exploits? If you can put it that way with Pepys, but maybe not with Wigglesworth.
Yeah, very different. But I think partly, as I have talked about in the lecture, was the way they use the diary. But that might in itself obviously being very revealing in terms of their differences in character.
And place as well.
And place as well. So I think maybe we start with place. That's a really good suggestion. I think very often we think of Puritans as or maybe English Protestants as almost like a group of people who are very similar to each other in 17th century. And New England probably very similar. But there might be differences in the sense that, okay, these are maybe more, you can see more congregationalists, the congregational churches in New England, different way of governing the church and different maybe theology or different emphasis. But I think if we just compare these two diaries, obviously the samples are small, we can see how there are two different cultures that we can observe and just attitudes to sex and sin. But we have to also bear in mind that one is same-sex desires, the other one is not. But still, it will be hard to imagine someone like Samuel Pepys be so reckless in his sexual advances, and the fact that he edited volumes of his diary for others to see after he died. It would be hard to conceive something like that in Puritan America. And you can see how for Pepys in London, he was able to not only make these moves, but he was found out in court quite a few times. And he was forced to tell at least a friend who sort of acts as an accountability friend. When one of the affairs was called multiple times by his wife. And it was able to still be kept sort of a secret. And the fact that surely a lot of people in the household or frequent guests to the house knew about. And he was very much a repeated offender in a sense. But he was able to keep his social status. There are a lot of things at play to make that happen, which would be very hard to see how the same thing could happen in New Haven or in Massachusetts, for example. And in terms of their diary keeping, it is clear that Samuel Pepys didn't keep the diary as a spiritual exercise. If Wigglesworth's diary was categorized by his dialogue with God, Samuel Pepys was very much talking to himself. At times, he talked to God, and there were a few cases where he prayed to God to help him in terms of kind of keeping himself loyal to his wife. But you can see very quickly he turned back to his old behavior, and the way he journaled some of the sexual behaviors that he had, he very much kind of relished in them. So they are very different.
About them almost to himself, doesn't he?
Yeah. But there are similarities. Like they both knew that these are very much unacceptable in the wider society. So they use, for example, coded language to prevent at least maybe servants or other people who are in the household to just open and read it. But the codes are not so. In Samuel Pepys' case, it wasn't so hard to crack. If you're educated, it wasn't so hard to decode.
Now we have a question that's come in before we close in a few minutes. Someone's asking, is Wigglesworth aware that there are other people with a similar struggle to his in terms of his same-sex attraction?
Okay.
Even if he dare not talk to them or try to find out, and does he feel, or on the other side, does he feel extremely isolated in feeling that? Does he think he's the only one?
I think he knew very well that he wasn't the only one. I wondered about that when I was writing this piece. Well, first of all, what we knew is that there are court records, and these things travel fast. It was not a big community, and the colonies, especially the three colonies nearby, Connecticut, New Haven, and Massachusetts, the news spread around among these colonies, and they have very similar shared values. And when it comes to any deviant sexual acts, these things are talked about, and so he would have been aware that he was not the only one, but he very likely would have thought that. Actually, I wonder whether that was the case. I think it's hard to tell in terms of what he thought, how rare that was. I think one way to explain it would be, it seems that he was the only one who was struggling, and he was definitely feeling very lonely because he couldn't share that very openly with his friends and his wife and family. But at the same time, because it was not talked about openly at all in the kind of culture that he was brought up in, the society that he was in, you wonder whether he just thought, oh, if you struggle with sexual lust, these thoughts came up. They certainly didn't think that for people who struggle with same-sex desires are just a certain group of people, and they are more likely, more prone to think that if you struggle intensely with sex, you might just it will lead to desires like this. At the same time, there are very few examples of people sort of speculating, oh, there are some people who had more of a propensity to this. So we have seen that as well. But these records are very few and very rare to see.
We do know, of course, that there were people who experienced these same-sex desires who were very happy to indulge them and open. I remember there's a wonderful salacious book by John White, one of John Wesley's ancestors. John White, a Puritan writing in the 1640s, who writes a book against the scandalous, malignant priests of the Church of England as a way of trying to get rid of these people. And number one in his list of 100 scandalous, malignant priests in the Church of England is a literal Catholic person. I think his name is John Wilson, as I recall. And he's very Catholic in some of his understandings of theology, but he also boasts about having slept with 18 men in his parish and goes around preaching that practice is not a sin. So we know that that's in the context. And yet here we have someone like Wigglesworth who experiences the attraction, but knows that that's not the way to theologically rationalize it. So that again is another parallel perhaps to today, and how we might learn from the past from these parallels. Mark, do you have any final questions?
No. It's been fascinating. I look forward to reading the actual lecture in print again in due course to reflect on it further. Very good.
Good. Well, our time is up, and there are no further questions that I can see on Facebook. So it's been a wonderful evening. Thank you so much, Dr. Wang, for your time and your labor on that excellent, insightful and eye-opening lecture. We very much appreciate that. Do look out for that, everybody, in print very shortly, just after the new year. Hopefully we'll have that in print from Latimer Trust. And do join us again next year for the 2024 St Antholin Lecture. I wish you all a very happy, good evening.
Thank you.